Hey everyone, welcome in. Ready for a deep dive today? We're tackling a topic I know a lot of you have been asking us to unpack, Islamophobia, and specifically how it exists even in societies that call themselves democracies. Kind of makes you scratch your head, right?
Yeah, it's a fascinating paradox. How can systems built on freedom and equality still end up with this level of bias?
Big questions. And to get into them, we're going deep on this presentation all about the global struggles Muslims are facing.
And it's a presentation that really hits on something important right off the bat, defining what Islamophobia actually is. Because it's not as simple as just disliking Islam, is it? It goes way beyond that.
It's true. Look, disagreeing with the religion's ideas, that's one thing. We've all got our own beliefs. But this presentation, it draws a line in the sand. It's about when you start targeting people simply for being Muslim, that's when things shift.
Right. It becomes about the person, not just the belief system. And that's where this idea of irrational comes in. It's fear, it's hatred that isn't based in logic or personal experience. But even though it doesn't make sense, it still leads to real harm in the world.
And speaking of harm, this presentation makes the point that while Islamophobia obviously existed before, the world after 9/11 became a turning point.
Oh, absolutely. The war on terror, as necessary as some people felt it was at the time, there was this side effect, you could say. That association got stuck in some people's minds. Islam equals terrorism, even though, of course, most Muslims condemn violence just like anyone else.
And it wasn't just a shift in how individuals thought.
Okay.
It was bigger than that. I mean, think back to those early 2000s. You had all this language being thrown around, whole countries labeled as threats, axis of evil, that kind of thing.
Which, whether it was intentional or not, it created this environment, right, where suspicion could so easily be directed at anyone who even looked like they might fit that very blurry definition of an enemy.
It's like all you needed was one piece of a picture, and suddenly, in some people's minds, you were the enemy.
Mm-hmm.
And it wasn't just talk. Sadly, the presentation actually points out that in the U.S., hate crimes against Muslims, they jumped up by 1,600% after 9/11. That's not random. That's a direct impact.
Which is why understanding the history, that's where this presentation is so important. Because then we can see how those tactics, those fear tactics, they're not just a thing of the past. They're still being used today.
Like a dusty old playbook that some people are all too happy to pull out and use again.
Yeah.
So we've got what Islamophobia is. We've got some of the history. How about we see how this is all playing out in the world today? The presentation, it breaks things down by region, starting with Europe. What's the big picture over there?
Sure.
So Europe, right, you've got all these different histories, cultures, everything. But this presentation is saying there's this worrying common thread when it comes to Islamophobia.
Yeah, and this is where it goes beyond just like individuals being prejudiced. You know, that we're talking about the system itself, the institutions being biased. The presentation really focuses on how a lot of governments, they're putting laws into place that, sure, on paper, they don't say Muslims can't do this, but the impact, it lands way harder on Muslims than anyone else. Sneaky, right. Like it's baked right into everything.
Yeah.
And they use France as a big example, which is kind of weird when you first think about it.
Totally. Because France, they're all about secularism, right? Church and state, totally separate. But in trying to do that, they've ended up with these policies that, well, a lot of people see them as discriminatory, especially towards Muslim women.
Yeah, the face covering ban, that's the one everyone thinks of. Didn't come right out and say Muslims, but hard to miss the connection, you know?
And that's what's so ironic. This law, it's supposed to be about freedom, everyone moving through the world without restrictions. But for some Muslim women, it does the opposite. Suddenly, they're less free to express their faith the way they want to.
Yeah.
Like this weird double standard. And even if the law isn't always used in a super aggressive way, the fact that it's there, that creates this whole atmosphere where, I don't know, the potential for things to go wrong is just hanging over you.
Mm-hmm.
No wonder this presentation says over 70% of Muslims in France, they say they've experienced some kind of Islamophobia.
70%, that's huge. And it's not like France is alone in this. Germany, they bring that up too. They've had this big jump in Islamophobic attacks lately, like not even subtle stuff.
Straight up violence.
Yeah, we're talking vandalizing mosques, people being harassed, just walking down the street, even physical assaults. It's actually scary how quickly things can escalate when you let this kind of prejudice fester.
And it gets dangerous fast. So it's France, it's Germany. It's almost like this whole wave moving across Europe.
It's not limited to mainland Europe either. The UK, since Brexit, they've seen their own share of hate crimes aimed at Muslims. And what's really worrying there is how some politicians, they've used all the uncertainty after Brexit. Like, it's an opportunity, right? Scapegoating, pointing fingers, and who's an easy target?
Muslims, in their eyes.
It's like that saying, never let a good crisis go to waste, but in this messed up situation.
Except the waste is people's safety, their sense of belonging. It's awful.
Totally. Using fear for political game, it's a pattern we see over and over. And not just in Europe, as the presentation gets into. The U.S., just as bad, maybe even worse in some ways.
Which blows my mind, honestly. You'd think a country founded on this whole idea of religious freedom, right? We should be immune to this stuff. But the presentation does not hold back. Not even close.
And this is where they bring up this term, institutional Islamophobia. It's not just about, like, individual jerks being mean. It's woven into the system itself. Institutions, policies, they're set up in a way that puts Muslims at a disadvantage. Whether it's intentional or not, the impact is real.
Okay, so what does that actually look like here in the U.S.? Give us an example.
Well, the presentation points to Trump's Muslim ban. Remember that. That's a prime example. Whatever the stated goal was, stopping terrorism, they said it specifically targeted these Muslim-majority countries.
And whether they meant to or not, the message it sent, it was loud and clear.
Yeah.
It's basically saying, you're not welcome here just because of your faith.
Like this deep-seated fear of anyone different, anyone other, which sadly, some politicians, they're happy to exploit that fear, but it goes even deeper than that. This presentation, it argues that this institutional Islamophobia, it's not just about who gets let into the country. It's about how Muslims are treated once they're here.
Which brings us to that whole surveillance issue, right? The NYPD, they had that whole program, the Muslim surveillance program.
Yeah, it got a ton of criticism, and rightfully so. They were profiling Muslims, plain and simple. Imagine this. You're put under surveillance, not because you did anything, but because of your faith. How you dress, where you pray. Suddenly, that makes you suspicious.
Guilty until proven innocent, which is like the opposite of how it's supposed to work, right?
Completely undermines the whole idea of justice, of due process. And the thing is, that NYPD program, not even a one-off. The presentation also talks about CVE, the Countering Violent Extremism Initiative.
Okay, so CDE. I mean, on the surface, countering extremism sounds like a good thing, so what's the problem?
The problem is how they go about it. CVE, they rely on these assumptions about what extremism even is, and those assumptions, often based on stereotypes, not actual evidence. Critics say it ends up targeting people based on their religion, their ethnicity, rather than anything they've actually done.
So you could be a totally peaceful person, just living your life, but because you fit some profile they've cooked up, suddenly you're on their radar.
Exactly. It's like pre-crime, almost, judging people for what they might do, not what they have done. And as the presentation points out, that creates this atmosphere, this constant fear and suspicion, and that does real damage.
Okay, so we're seeing how this prejudice, it shows up in the laws and the policies and the very systems that are supposed to protect us. But it gets worse. The presentation goes on to say that this climate of fear, it's being deliberately fueled by two major forces.
And those two forces are media and political rhetoric. Both of them, they have huge power in shaping how the public sees the world, what we think, even how we feel.
It's like they feed off each other, right?
Yeah.
Politicians, they use people's fears to get ahead, and the media, they know fear sells, so they play it up for those clicks and ratings. It's a messed up cycle.
A vicious cycle, for sure. And this presentation, they make a really good point about the media specifically. It's not just that they report on these things, it's how they frame it, the stories they choose to tell. And when it comes to Muslims and Islam, there's a very particular narrative they often fall back on.
Oh, you're talking about that whole thing with terrorism, right? How Muslims are overrepresented in those stories.
Exactly. Like this presentation, they found a study showing that more than 80% of media stories about Muslims, the focus was on terrorism or extremism. And look, I'm not saying terrorism isn't real. It's obviously a huge problem. But when that's practically the only story you hear about an entire group of people, it creates a really skewed perception.
Totally. Like, imagine if we only ever talked about Christianity when some extremist group did something awful or some weird cult, right? People would start to think that's all Christianity is, which obviously isn't true at all.
Exactly. That's the danger of these narrow narratives, especially when they're based in fear. You start to forget about the individuals, the humanity. Suddenly, it's easy to write off a whole group of people, and then it's easier to justify treating them badly.
And unfortunately, this isn't just happening on, like, cable news or whatever, right?
Yeah.
It's everywhere. Social media especially, it's become this breeding ground for harmful stuff.
Oh, absolutely. Those algorithms, they don't care about facts, just about keeping people glued to their screens. So the more outrageous, the more inflammatory, the better. And hate spreads like wildfire online.
So where do we even go from here? It feels like such a huge, overwhelming problem.
It is huge, no doubt. And this presentation, they get that. They're not pretending there's some easy fix. But they also make it clear that change is possible. It just takes work. And it has to happen on a bunch of different levels.
Like what? Where do we even start?
Well, they really emphasize education. And not just like schools and stuff, though that's definitely part of it, but just being willing to learn, to unlearn some of the stuff we've been told, and to actively seek out different perspectives, challenge ourselves, have those tough conversations.
Which, let's be real, those conversations can be super uncomfortable.
Yeah.
This is deep-seated prejudice we're talking about. It's not always going to be pretty.
No, it's not. But sometimes those awkward, messy conversations, that's where real growth happens. When you're forced to confront your own biases, really listen to what other people are saying. That's how you start to see the world differently.
It's about remembering that at the end of the day, we're all human, right? We all deserve respect.
Exactly. It shouldn't matter what your faith is, or your background, or your beliefs. Everyone deserves to feel safe and respected.
And that's really what it all comes down to, isn't it? Creating a world where everyone feels like they belong.
Absolutely. And it might seem impossible sometimes, but it's a goal worth fighting for.
I'm with you on that. So to everyone listening, thank you for coming on this journey with us, for being willing to dive deep into these tough issues. Keep those minds open, keep asking those hard questions, and we'll be back again soon with another deep dive. Until then, take care.